We have here Nana Akua Anidoho from the University of Ghana. Just raise your hand because these are the introductions. This is how fast I'm going to go because I want to hear them speak. Abo City George from Barnard in Columbia. Wave. Okay. Sean Jacobs from the New School. Mukoma Wan Ngugi from Cornell. Karina Ray from Brandeis. Ben Talton Temple. And Meredith Toretta, University of Ottawa. And Rudolph Ware, Butch Ware from the University of California at Santa Barbara. So this is what the email that I sent to them. The essay in African Studies in the U.S. more broadly remains sites where knowledge production, institutional power, and professional opportunities and advancements continue to be shaped by race in profoundly unequal ways. As we look at our present and into our future, are we destined to reproduce these structures of power and inequality, or can you imagine constructive initiatives capable of bringing about sustainable, transformative change?
So I come first?
Nana Akua.
Okay.
You can sit right. You can sit if you want.
I guess I'll just vibrate.
Oops. Good morning, and I'm very pleased to be on this panel. I'm very inspired after the previous panel, really. I am, I think, the only Africa-based scholar on the panel, and so I will attempt to provide a continental perspective, while obviously realizing that I can't represent all scholars working on the continent of Africa. In the first place, I am the kind of Africa-based scholar who had her graduate education in the global north and who moves back and forth between the US and Africa. So this does give me a useful comparative perspective, but it is itself a kind of privilege that many African scholars don't have. So I do want to recognize that. Jean's lecture last night has provoked us once again to engage with, have an open discussion about race and privilege in the ASA. That is obviously very crucial that we have. And the history that Jean gave, and which the previous panelist also spoke to, highlights the questions of race and the solidarity of African and African American scholars in standing up to that racism inherent, I guess, in the very genesis of the ASA. And I value this solidarity very much. As a graduate student at Northwestern in the late 90s, early 2000s, my biggest allies were African American students. They were the people who helped me to recognize, first of all, and then to navigate racial politics. They were the people who I went to when I needed interpretation, like when a professor said to me, "You write so well." And I would go to them and say, so is that I write so well generally, or I write English so well for an African student? How do I feel about this? Is it a compliment? Is it not a compliment? However, if I'm to speak from the perspective of someone who's working and researching on the continent, I'll say that putting all the attention on racial politics or white privilege in the US academy will miss out on the important geopolitical question. Because another perspective that we need to have on this engagement is that we have a dominant academy in the most dominant country in the world, with both black and white academics studying and relating to a continent whose academics are often sidelined in the investigation of their own societies. And that's very important. So I think we need to keep a perspective on these complexities, these intersections of race and geopolitical location and gender, as Jean's graphs showed last night. So given these complexities, it's hard to propose one or two initiatives that can bring about the kind of change that I'm sure we'd all like to see. I think that above all, we need a commitment to continuous self-reflection so that we can continue to address a problem that we'll have to admit will never go away. Power and privilege never completely disappear. They may wax and wane, they may shift, but they do persist. So at a general level, I would like to advocate for a commitment to addressing hierarchies of all sorts, including and beyond white privilege. But if I have to be more specific, as Jean asked us to be, then I will say that, well, I have a few thoughts. In my first ASA meeting as a graduate student, I think this might have been in 2000, I met only the few Africa-based participants who had significant US networks and funding to attend ASA meetings, and these were people who had also been trained here for the most part. And I'm pleased that there is more of that kind of representation. I think me being on this panel and my role in this year's meeting it's a step in that direction. But concretely, I would like to see more representation in terms of leadership on the program committee, on the advisory board of scholars based on the continent. I see that ASA is taking steps to engage more directly with scholars and institutions on the continent, instead of expecting those scholars to travel unidirectionally to, the US for meetings. So I admire the efforts of the African Studies Review Board to establish a pipeline for publishing young African scholars. The fellowships offered by the ASA and foundations like Carnegie to bring especially PhD candidates and early career faculty to ASA meetings are also important. I appreciate the ASA joins conferences with continental institutions and associations, including Codestria, which is a hugely important institution. This is the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa. So an old association and one that has been really important in the past few decades, especially during those times in the 80s when higher education institutions and higher education learning in general on the continent was being underfunded and sort of neglected. And of course, the African Studies Association of Africa, which Akosua Domakwampofu mentioned. But even here, I'd like to bring up a little caution that we need to ensure that these well-intentioned interventions don't reinforce hierarchies rooted in the continent's colonial history. And so here I'm thinking specifically about how easy it is for us to engage in Africa by engaging with South Africa mostly. And I think that's something we need to be cautious about. And then in the 10 seconds I have left, I want to say that I do remain optimistic. My own history of ASA does not go back nearly as far as some of you. But I've been coming to the ASA for maybe 18 years, and I see changes in the visibility and locations of African-based scholars in the association. Like Akosua said, ASA was my intellectual home. I was in a department that didn't know anything about Africa, so the program of African Studies at Northwestern was where I went to feel connected, and ASA gave me that same feel, although I have to say most of that was the Ghana Studies Association in particular. But it's still the only academic meeting I attend regularly, and I do see enough to encourage me to continue to invest in making this the kind of association that we can all be very proud of. And I do hope that 20 years from now, when we have another retrospective panel reflecting on the history of ASA, that it will have a much more celebratory tone. Thank you.
Yeah, let's see.
Okay, thank you everyone for staying. Thank you to the earlier panel for giving us so much of this really needed history of ASA. And my comments are going to be maybe taking off from the question of racial politics, but thinking about how it intersects with gender and sexuality. So the question we were given by Jean was, as we look at our present and into our future as an association, are we destined to reproduce the structures of power and inequality, or can we imagine constructive initiatives capable of bringing about sustainable transformative change? So that's two parts. I'm going to address the first part, this question of whether we are destined to reproduce structures of power and inequality. In some ways, I think yes, we are, for a bit of a while before we see fundamental transformative change. And I see this because we have a tremendous pipeline issue. One way that it's been raised already is with the paucity of kind of students coming into African studies. But looking at it from a kind of a gender and sexuality perspective, I'm also interested in those students who managed to come to African studies classes, managed to make it through programs, managed to find some fire and some interest in an academic career in African studies. And the problems that some of them have with finding adequate, appropriate, supportive mentorship going forward. I'm particularly interested in the experience of African women, younger scholars coming into this field, and we can see from the graphs we were shown about the profound marginalization of African women that comes through the complex of racial and gender politics in the ASA. One of the things I was thinking when I learned about the Society of Fellows or the Council of Fellows, what was it called? College of Fellows. The College of Fellows was that, the disbanding of the College of Fellows didn't disappear the fellows. It invisibilizes them, right? So you can continue to have a College of Fellows, but without actually knowing who they are anymore. And that connected to one of the peculiar dimensions of the racial politics of the ASA, which involves the de-racialization of Africans, means that you could have an expansion of the invisible College of Fellows to now include, African men, right? You could have African men as well as senior European or descendant men. Or non-racialist men, right? So you can kind of expand and diversify an invisible College of Fellows, and in so doing, expand and diversify the class of gatekeepers in the African studies community. I'm very concerned that one of the effects of this, I have encountered several examples of emerging kind of young women scholars who come into the association with, a lot of enthusiasm and energy and excitement about coming into careers as intellectuals, and who become frustrated professionally, sometimes literally through gatekeeping in the form of blocking jobs or gatekeeping in the form of blocking publications, and that is sometimes kind of directed at them as forms of punishment or forms of kind of censure for warding off uninvited attention. So this is an experience that many emerging women scholars are having in the ASA. So these are scholars who have somehow crossed the border of one of the crucial borders in this pipeline issue of getting through these programs and then actually moving into a profession. So the point of frustration comes at the point of professionalization, right, within this body. This is an issue that we really need to, I want to bring to kind of the forum, to kind of public, to greater attention, because it is an issue that is perpetuated by the kind of invisible continuing council or college of fellows. So as we think about, the racial politics of the ASA, the kinds of hierarchies and inequalities that it produces, I wanted to think about how that racial politics intersects with gender politics, how it may have proliferated a more diverse kind of class of, a more diverse and invisible college of fellows, a phenomenon that I call, Babaism in the ASA. And what is the impact, what does that kind of amount to when we look at the statistics and the record that we've seen on the differential valuation, representation, and elevation of different constituencies within the ASA, especially Black women and African women. Thank you.
So I brought my computer because I have a tendency to sort of go on and on. So thanks to Jean for inviting me to be on this panel. First, this is a long overdue public conversation as a public reckoning and at this level of the ASA. Second, Jean's speech last night was powerful in its emotion and force. Third, and this is my disclaimer, I'm not sure I can entirely do justice to the import of that talk, in terms of its impact especially. I went to bed last night, I woke up this morning, and I came here, and this was it's a big moment for the ASA, and I'm not sure I can entirely capture all of it, of course I'm gonna try. So fourth, my full disclosure, I am speaking here also as a board member. I think I'm the only board member who's on this panel at the moment. So I speak here as a South African who grew up under apartheid and arrived here as a graduate student in the mid-1990s on a Fulbright scholarship to Northwestern University. So there we go again. And I went to my first ASA 2 years later in November 1998 at the 41st meeting in Chicago. I remember even then that questions, murmurs, and debates in the corridors. After all, it was only 3 years after Philip Curtin's Ghettoizing African Studies about attitudes about the association. What Siraj Rasool from UWC summarized Jean's talk in a tweet as, quote, the unrelenting perpetuation of whiteness in US African studies and in the ASA, unquote. It is also important to recognize, as Jean herself said, what she presented is not new material, that some Africanists in and outside the ASA have talked about, arranged panels about these issues, including at this conference where there are panels on the decolonization of the canon, for example. I think right now as I'm speaking. The key point is that the issues were raised many times since 1957 when the ASA was founded, but not fully dealt with by the ASA. One anecdote, the history was most starkly illustrated to me when in the early 2000s, I was invited to a conference at the University of Florida to debate, or I assume to celebrate the legacy of Glendon Carter. There I witnessed Dennis Brutus, in a way, challenge and publicly disrupt perceptions of Carter's time at Northwestern and her work on South Africa because of his support while on the run from the South African government, not for just his anti-apartheid work, but in the struggles for racial justice at that university and allying with Black students. I think he was even leading them, as well as in the city broadly. But I've never experienced this kind of debate at this level. I also want to make a small point about the role of the board, and perhaps we can communicate what the board does better, but a number of initiatives are already underway or in the works to transform who leads and make decisions at the ASA, as well as for confronting this scandalous history. So let's get then to, if we have to talk about what has to be done, and I think I'm not sure my one friend who's a communist is here, to quote Lenin. First, in terms of unfinished business, as a first step, a public reckoning is necessary. In that public reckoning, a telling of what alternative histories or mainstreaming those counter-narratives of that longer history of the role of African-American scholars that long predate the Fellows or Herskovits. In a way, ASA needs, for want of a better word, a kind of a TRC. Secondly, you can see I come from South Africa, although I have my own criticisms of the TRC. Secondly, publicizing it beyond this forum. So it can't just, I know that this is a very specific issue that relates to our own history, but it has to be publicized beyond this forum in spaces like the Chronicle of Higher Education, where the previous article appeared, popular media, including social media. Beyond the symbolism of renaming the Herskovits Prize, there's a harder job of interrogating or acting on how the founding of the ASA set up a system that hid behind discourses of neutrality, as Jean last night broke down so well, that served to exclude certain traditions and scholars, and finally also, as we heard last night, prevented the practice of ensuring and preventing the practice of ensuring that the problem of inclusion cannot become the problem of black scholars. It's not the job of black scholars to make that happen, to make that change happen, ensuring that that doesn't happen. In terms of radical transformation, and in terms of the future of African Studies scholarship, and for the people who are taking the organization forward, I would also recommend, this is particularly my South African experience, replicating what Jean was doing in affiliated organizations as well as in local contexts. And again, I know earlier speaker said we should not fixate on South Africa, but if you think a number of South Africans, white South Africans, have played leading roles in this organization. Leonard Thompson, I saw last night, C.W. de Kiewiet was a founding fellow of the ASA, etc. And also to look, I would actually recommend looking at things in South Africa, look at how people have dealt with some of these kind of affairs, the Mafeja affair, and how the Mafeja affair has been revisited in South Africa, and how people have attempted to make right by not just his family, but also in terms of the public record of the University of Cape Town and the university systems there. But even more broadly, how more recently in South Africa at universities, faculty, students have attempted to confront these racist pasts, and connected that scholars, younger scholars, should be encouraged to undertake disciplinary history, and also where some of that disciplinary history exists already, to bring it to the fore. Second, this is just a practical question, to intervene. I think this question of who comes to the ASA, who's represented here, to actively intervene in the kind of the visa regime, and I know the board is involved in some of that work. Thirdly, and I'm about to finish, the role of the ASA board. This is actively taking positions on leadership positions, board nominations, the journals in terms of representation and the kind of scholarships that appears in there. And then finally, this debate about scholarship, or what people call engaged scholarship or activist scholarship, not shying away, because I think this is probably where some of the earlier issues around when African Americans left the ASA in 1968, the group of African Americans who did it at the time, was around this debate of the ASA acting as if it is divorced from the political context. And I haven't checked yet, but I was struck that there is absolutely no public comment about, for example, in the place that we are meeting, the kind of broader political context of electoral manipulation, voter suppression, and open racism. Thank you.
You sounded very awake.
Yeah, let's see.
I like keeping my own time, just to be sure my minutes don't get stolen. So let me first begin by thanking Professor Jean Allman and also Professor Karina Ray, for inviting me in what I think is a very important interventionist conversation. So but as I was thinking about about the things I want to raise here, I couldn't get over the term white privilege, right? And my thinking now is that the more we try to defeat white privilege, the stronger it gets, right? It's as if we are caught in this loop, right? So that's how racism also works. The more you try to defeat racism on its own terms, the more it consumes your energies. So and I think that's why we keep asking the same questions. I was going back to Michelle Mogo's 1996 speech, that was referred to by the previous panel. Where actually, if you haven't read it, it's a very brilliant document, right? So I highly recommend it. It's also aesthetically pleasing. Where actually, a part where she says we badly need to converse. But she raises several issues in her talk. She talks about underrepresentation, this is 1996, underrepresentation of African scholars and non-reference to African scholarship, overall absence of African American, African Caribbean, and other scholars of colors, as well as their work, marginalization of current African faculty from hosting institutions, non-inclusion of Kiswahili in presentations, the inequality of intellectual exchange between Africanists in America and African scholars on the mother continent. So I was trying to understand, so we keep asking the same questions, but if we keep privileging white privilege, what are some of the other questions we are not raising, right? And certainly one of the questions that we are answering now is the relationship between Africans and African Americans. But also the other things, for example, if you take Hakowitz and Du Bois, right, and you just put them together, then it becomes an epic battle between Hakowitz and Du Bois, right? But the question, you could ask the question the other way around, where does Hakowitz fit in W. Du Bois's universe? Or a better example, and this is more concrete than, Cuba sent 400 doctors during the Ebola crisis, 400 doctors during the Ebola crisis in Western Africa, right? But again, if we keep looking at racism and white privilege, then we end up just talking about the US, the white doctors who came back, the racism, and so on and so forth, right? Instead of concentrating on, the Cubans. The Cubans also had gone to Angola. Mandela credits them with breaking apartheid's back, and so on and so forth. So let me continue some of the questions then, that we are not asking when we center whiteness. Okay, so the very nature of knowledge production, this we have talked about, where we as scholars are taught not to give. But there's something that I always find interesting, how we as scholars can study, let's say, Nelson Mandela or Ruth First, and really not feel, and maybe get a tenure job because of that, and really not feel an ethical responsibility. And this is something that somebody in the previous panel raised, and really not feel an ethical responsibility of first making that knowledge available to, I guess South Africans. No, I'm joking, not really. But to the general public in general, right? And I keep going back to one of my professors some time back.
I'm so sorry. It's echoing, and I want everybody to fully.
Oh, okay. Actually, I don't think I need the mic. No. Okay, fine. So I remember some time back one professor asking me why I'm writing publicly, right? This is during the second Gulf War. And she called me to office. She's like, "Yeah, why are you writing public? Why are you wasting your time? You could be writing about the reader." So, and if we agree that indeed it's desirable, to make this knowledge public, in what language, right? So again, we take knowledges from let's say, like, we go study my own people. I go study the Gikoyo, have that study in English, right? And not feel an ethical responsibility to make that knowledge available to the same people I've studied, right? Then again, if we keep privilege in white privilege, then what we do with the white scholars who have done really good work, I mean, Basil Davidson, Colin Lays, Caroline Elkins, right? Again, because in other words, wouldn't we be better off than taking Caroline Elkins or somebody like that as a model? Or in terms of activism, Joe Slovo or Ruth First, white people, Ruth First who got assassinated by the apartheid government. Aren't those better models? Isn't that a better starting point for us to start this debate than to always go back, to the binary of black and white privilege? So to finish quickly, so how do we center African languages in the production of knowledge? I think that's a very important question, and it will continue. That question will never go away, no matter how much we want to, we want to sweep it under the rug. And 4 seconds left. Okay, so I'll just say one last thing. I don't see a way out. I don't see a way out unless we become scholar activists, right? We can't be intellectuals in ether, right? So I do think we have to embrace scholar activism as a model. Thank you.
I think I'm just gonna.
That's a very good idea.
So I thought that I knew a lot about this history before I started working with Jean on these 2 roundtables. It's the starting point for every Intro to African History course that I teach. We don't start talking about the history of Africa before we start talking about the history of the field, how we get to know that history. And the process of doing this work together, and especially being in communication with my colleagues here and the panelists on the Ruptures Roundtable, has just been kind of transformative for me to really deepen my understanding. And I want to just say thank you for just allowing me the opportunity to deepen my knowledge in that way. So one of the things that I started thinking about as we were doing the Ruptures Roundtable was, I think it's really important to be able to name problems and also to actually be able to call people out, right? And to be able to say, to talk about that history in a way in which we don't have to mask things, right? Where we can just say this is what was going on, and this was who was doing X and Y. And so I think that's really important. And I think also last night, one of the things that Jean said was that it's a practice of exemplifying much broader trends when we speak about individual people, right? So what happens when we sort of move beyond some of the individuals who have been recurrent names in the racism that has plagued this association? I mean, the numbers of people at those meetings were in the thousands, right? The Johnson-Cole resolution was voted down by a wide membership, right? So the question then becomes not just these figureheads, but all of the less visible, perhaps even invisible members of the association who not only allowed it to happen, but voted for it. That's not history. It happens still today. I guarantee you that when a black person, whether from the continent or from the diaspora, gets a position, especially in one of the disciplines, and not just in a AAAS or Africana department, I bet you when they get that position, our generation, white Africanists, will make an assumption about why they got that position. I guarantee you that when a black person wins one of our prestigious prizes, there are assumptions made about why they got that prize. And it's not because they're geniuses. So I guess what I'm saying is that if we're going to move forward, in some ways, we're not going to be the ones to move forward because we're already forward, right? It's all of the people that are carrying on with this long-standing set of ideologies that's going to move forward, right? Or otherwise, we're just going to keep moving. So the question is, are you with us or are you going to be in the dust? And I think it resonates with what you're saying, which is, we can continue to talk about white privilege or we can just go on and continue to do our work, right? The last just other thing that I wanted to say is thinking about the landscape of African studies in the US and in Europe. The last couple of times I have done anything related to African studies in Europe has been a disaster. In the sense of it's almost complete Europeanness, white Europeanness, okay? So we have issues here in the US. There are issues in African studies in Europe that are so 1940s and 1950s, right? And when you come with a different perspective, it's a problem. I don't need to go into the details, but there's something going on within the context of Europe that needs to be addressed. However, the last time I was at University of Birmingham, actually, and I looked around and I realized that all of the black and brown people associated with African studies there were either postdocs or visiting lecturers from the continent, that the people that had tenured position were almost all white. And I raised that to somebody and they said, no, but we're really diverse, look around. And I said, yeah, but no. But then I started thinking to myself, you know what makes African studies in the US seem different? It's because of Africana studies, it's because of AAAS, it's because of black studies. That is where the vast majority of diversity within African studies is located. I think several years ago, there was the rankings that came out. I'm speaking to history now, for the discipline of history. And it was the top 4 or 5 PhD programs in the nation. By my count, I could be wrong, there were 2, I'm looking at 2 of them right now, maximum 3 Black people, 2, okay. So Nwando and Michelle represented in that group, right? That's a problem. So when you start looking at it that way, when you start looking at it from the disciplines, we are maybe 1960s, we're not in the 1940s, but there's something serious going on that we need to address between the disciplines and Black studies, and it's an old conversation, and clearly it's unfortunate that we still need to be having it. I'll end there.
Good afternoon. I was laughing because as Karina's talking, Nanekwe was looking over at me saying, now, what are you going to do? Thank you, Professor Allman, for your leadership and for inviting me to be on this panel, and thanks to the other panelists. I'm very proud to stand with you. So just think about this charge. How do we prevent the continuation of these inequities? How do we bring down white privilege and white supremacy? And so I'm just thinking about my own background and what I bring to it. I grew up in Harlem, in New York, and spent most of my weekends on 125th Street, where there are many West Indians and Africans and African Americans. And we were in this shared space together. There were differences, sometimes fierce differences, but we were part of the same community. We shared a lineage, right? We shared the same space. And from there, I went on to Howard University, where there was a similar community. And it's at Howard where I was taught that I was part of a strong lineage of teaching about Africa. The African diaspora was a required course for all students. And so I had scholars such as Dr. Linda Haywood, who was my professor, and Dr. Joseph Harris, and Dr. Jean Tungara, who I believe is here. And just thinking about what Makuma said about being activist scholars, we had activist teachers. They took teaching very seriously. And it wasn't just to affirm who we were. It wasn't just about feeling good about your Blackness and feeling proud about Africa or the Caribbean or African Americans in this country, because they weren't taking any nonsense. Dr. Haywood would say, I don't care if Cleopatra was Black. That's not what we're here to do. Whether Hannibal was Black or not, that's not what we're training you to be scholars. And you have to be able to go to them and undermine what they are doing and then build up what we're doing. So I just want to make 2 points about ways in which we might prevent the continuation of these inequities, and that's just about teaching and leadership. We spent a great deal of time on graduate education, and we spent a great deal of time on scholarship. I think most of us know that our voice is heard most not through our scholarship and not to our graduate students, but to undergraduates. And most of us are teaching white Americans. So we're teaching white Americans about Black people. So we need to be very conscious of what we're doing and what they're bringing into the classroom when they arrive to learn about Africa or the Caribbean, okay? And so we have to be activist teachers. And we need to be aware of what racism looks like. It's not just, we can't assume that we've moved past that. We took care of that in 1965. So when we teach about colonialism, we're teaching about white supremacy. And we need to call it white supremacy. We're dealing with white supremacy in our institutions. We need to recognize that. So we have a job, we have an obligation. We are responsible to be activist teachers. We have to undermine what the nonsense our colleagues are teaching about Europe, the nonsense our colleagues are teaching about America, and the nonsense they're learning about Africa. So we don't have the luxury of being a French historian or teaching about France. We have to be activists. That's our job. That's our job. And we will continue to perpetuate the inequities that Dr. Allman talked about unless we take that role very seriously. Undergraduates need to be front and center. So I like to see ASA take on, we had the K through 12 workshops. We talk about graduate training, but we need to talk about undergraduate teaching as well. We need to have a plan for that and be deliberate about that. My second point is a little more optimistic, and it's about leadership. I think Dr. Allman is a tremendous leader. She's here at the right time, and she's here for a reason. I think she reflects some of the changes going on in ASA. And I'll just point to two examples that's slowly turning this massive ship around, one of which is sitting right next to me. Nanekia is president of Ghana Studies Association. I'm proud to be a member of Ghana Studies Association. One of the reasons why I come every year is for Ghana Studies. And just as an example of transformative leadership, Ghana Studies are two leaders now, both reside on the African continent. And that's a big deal. We're making a statement about who we are and what we do with that. And it's not about making a way for them. It's not like people say, oh, Barack Obama was elected president, that's progress for black people, that's progress for white people, right? So, black folks have been fine. Black folks have always been fine. We're waiting for white folks to catch up. So it's not about allowing Ghanaians to run the Ghana Studies Association. It's about stepping out of the way and letting them take their rightful place at the head of these organizations, right? So another example, so we have Ghana Studies Association, we have our every 3 years we meet in Ghana. And our business is not to support our colleagues in Ghana. It's to be in collaboration and conversation with our colleagues in Ghana. So it is not looking down on them. It's not development. It's not assistance. And finally, I think Benjamin Lawrence has really set an example with African Studies Review of trying to put African voices in scholarship front and center. He's been very deliberate about that. He's not just saying, well, many of these African scholars at African universities don't have the resources we have, so the quality is not where it needs to be. No, he's going to Africa and making sure that they know about ASR, and how can we make sure that your work fits what we're trying to do here. And so I think we have models of leadership. So I think Professor Allman at the top reflects some bubbling up on the bottom. So I think these are just my 2 points. I think we need to really think about our undergraduate teaching and just think about when we talk about representation and leadership, what do we mean? And I'll close there and wait for the conversation.
Okay. Create some room here. So I wanted to thank Jean Allman and Karina Rave for inviting me to contribute to this important conversation. And certainly to the panelists from the earlier panel, as well as my co-panelists here. I've certainly learned a lot that I can take back to Canada, as the Canadian Association of African Studies is undergoing a sort of transformation and is beginning to ponder some of the questions similar to the ones we're discussing here today. So I want to make 3 points, one about memorializing and the way things are commemorated, one about historical contingency, and one about impunity or accountability. So I really started thinking about this roundtable during a trip to Johannesburg recently for an event called Listening to the Rivonia Trial. And that event launched the digital sound archive of the Rivonia Trial. And they're now available, by the way, at the National Archives of South Africa. And during my trip there, I went to Pretoria. And in Pretoria, I visited the Paul Kruger Monument, and I visited the Voortrekker Monument. And the thing about these monuments, as anyone who's been to them knows, is really their sheer size and dominance and permanence on the landscape. Right? These are not monuments that were erected to one day be torn down. And as I think about the way dominant figures in African studies are commemorated and memorialized, the Pretoria monuments keep coming back to mind. Damn. So we've talked about Herskovits, and I think we've talked sufficiently about him that I won't talk about him here. But we might think that the commemorative mode that surrounded his legacy is a thing of the past. But in fact, we can see similar things, similar patterns ongoing. So let's take Jan van Sina. He passed away in February 2017. As an alumni of the African History program at Wisconsin, I was privy to the outpourings on listservs. I was invited to the ASA panels. I think there were 4 or 5 last year to commemorate his work and him as a figure. I was asked to participate in fundraising for the Jan Van Sina Fund. And so throughout the ways and the hundreds of emails I was privy to read talking about this figure, I noticed that Jan Van Sina was remembered recurrently as the father, or sometimes even the grandfather, of African history. And through this memorialization, as it was going on, of Van Sina as the field's pater familias, I kept remembering W.E.B. Du Bois's dismissal in a footnote in Jan Van Sina's memoir, Living with Africa. And I first read this book as a graduate student at Wisconsin. And even as I read it, the idea for a paper formed. I haven't written it, but I have a title. And that title is How Du Bois Became a Footnote in Jan Van Sina's Memoir. So let me be very, very clear. I'm not questioning Van Sina's importance as a researcher or the value of his contributions. I can acknowledge his empirical contributions while refusing to view him as the father of African history. And I can consider the importance of his interdisciplinary research while also questioning the non-place he assigns Du Bois in his memoir. I can appreciate paths in the rainforest while questioning the historic attrition rate of students of color from the Wisconsin African History Program. So that's memorializing. I'll move on now to contingency. So what Jean and the Ruptures panel at this annual meeting have done is to critically genealogize African studies. I mean, that's what I'm calling it. I don't know if they would share that label, but that's what I observe happening. And critical genealogizing exposes the historical contingencies that gave rise to whatever it is being genealogized, in this case, African studies. And when historical contingencies are exposed, the hidden assumptions underlying them are brought to the surface as well. And I think that's what we're doing here on the Futures panel. We're deciding to bring contingencies and the assumptions that they generated to the surface. And when we do that, we think about where and how to redirect. So what must fall, what must change? Here's where I talk about impunity. Impunity with which white scholars exclude or commit microaggressions of various kinds without consequence. As just one example, there was a project initiated in March 2016 to launch an Oxford Research Encyclopedia of African History, which aimed to cover the entire range and sweep of African history, quite ambitious in its aim. And when the initial call for contributions went out, the 15-member editorial board was entirely white, and only 3 of the editors were women. And no continentally based editors were included among them, with the exception of a white male South African professor emeritus. Karina Ray undertook to organize an intervention, and 33 of us signed a professionally worded letter indicating our concern. What is most remarkable, however, I find, was that the editor-in-chief of the project did not once respond to any of those who expressed concern, but left it all to an Oxford University Press senior editor to sort out. And although the editorial board was gradually reconstituted, the project has continued without any negative impact or accountability whatsoever for those who launched it that way. So I'm going to conclude with this question that I ponder quite a bit myself, which is, what is the role of the white scholar of Africa when it comes to the racial politics of knowledge production? And there are many things that we could suggest here as an answer, but I will focus on just one. I think white scholars must do the work of contestation and confrontation. We must do better at contesting and confronting assumed, informal, unconscious white solidarities, whether familiar, informal, or institutional. And this is something that I've learned as a result of conversations I've had for many years with colleagues, including many of whom are members of this panel. So I thank you for that. And when we think of the commemorative landscape of African studies, let us going forward take care where we build monuments and lay flowers, and the place we allow those we choose to commemorate to occupy.
I don't want to stand in front of Jean. So we've been asked to look forward. I couldn't possibly do that in this context without first looking back. So I teach at UC Santa Barbara. I taught for 10 years at the University of Michigan, 4 years before that at Northwestern University. I authored a book, The Walking Quran, a book just dropped today called Jihad of the Pen that I co-edited with my first 2 graduate students to get PhDs, Zachary Wright and Amir Syed. And none of that would have happened without Jean Allman, the woman who delivered the presidential address last evening. Because I walked into my first African history class with her at the University of Minnesota in 1995, thinking, what's this white lady gonna teach me about African history? Real talk. I am the son of a locksmith with a 6th grade education. I grew up in DC under the most probably crushing poverty any of y'all can imagine. I never finished a lease. We were evicted from every place we ever lived until I was 7 years old. The introduction that I had to African history was reading the Autobiography of Malcolm X and beginning to think that there was something to being Black that predated this misery. And a line stuck with me when I was listening to the presentations from the Ruptures panel this morning from that autobiography. Malcolm said, if a cat has kittens in an oven, you don't call them biscuits. What he was saying was, he followed it by saying, where is Negro land? Show me this place on a map that's called Negro land. He's saying, you as an African American, you are the descendant of Africans. Call yourself an African. So I walked into that classroom trying to find some deep knowledge about what predated this. And if I hadn't found a person with that kind of intellectual courage in the classroom, I would have turned around and walked right back out. And on the second day of that class, while I'm trying to think, what's this white lady gonna teach me about African history, she showed a slideshow of colonial lynchings in the Belgian Congo. And for 45 minutes, she pointed at these pictures and she said, you're gonna learn about social transformations in colonial Africa, you're gonna learn about gender change, you're gonna learn about urbanization. Never forget that none of it is possible unless this has already happened. And after that, I would ride with her for anything. And because of that, I have been able to pursue an academic career in this field, and been able to train graduate students, and been able to teach undergraduate students. And I had a conversation with one of those graduate students when I was at Northwestern, who had a Black student come into her classroom when she was a teaching assistant and ask her the question that I never had the nerve to ask Jean, what's this white lady gonna teach me about African history? And her response, and it's not important who this was that, what does biology have to do with history? And I told her, I said, you need another answer to that question. Because if that had been the answer that you had given me, you would have lost me forever. And I turned out to be an okay scholar in this field. The fact of the matter is, and I'll say another thing, is it's only her invitation that I've come to the African Studies Association because the racial politics of this institution and this meeting have driven me away from this place. I haven't been here in 6 or 7 years. And I think that there's a lot of us that feel that way, especially African Americans. Pearl raised the question about, or in the Ruptures panel, about, well, have we really reflected on the place of African Americans in this? And I'm going to go a step further on the space of African American males in this. There are 2 black women for every black man at every degree, from associates to PhD. Where are the African Americans and where are the African American men? We are being systematically excluded through all kinds of exclusionary practices before we even get into those classrooms, and then we find unwelcoming spaces there and we find unwelcoming spaces here, and we vote with our feet. So that's enough pessimism and looking backwards. Now I'll give some answers about things that move us forward. The first has already happened. This is one of those signal moments. This is one of those ruptures. This is one of those places where you can clearly demarcate what came before and what comes after. Last night's presidential address gives us an opportunity to have a frank and open conversation about the racial politics of our field. And we have to confess to one another that we as Africanists have marginalized ourselves in the academy by not beginning and ending our conversations about the place of Africa in the academy with the racial politics of this place. We lament and we complain that we are ignored, and yet we participate actively in that marginalization. Part of that has to do with the exclusion of diaspora studies and the broader diaspora from the way that we think about Africa. But why, as a historian, would I be tempted to think that African history ends at the physical borders of the continent of Africa? When Africans have traveled throughout the world, were they not carrying their histories with them? Were they not carrying their cultures with them? Were they not carrying their languages with them? I had a student at Michigan, Jamie Anderson, who's working on candomblé in Brazil, who wrote a 15-page paper on how you could use diaspora sources to write African history. Scholars of Senegambia have never used the many accounts from in 16th and 17th century Spanish sources about Jolofo slaves all over the New World to talk about political disruptions and transformations in Senegambia. We are not only marginalizing ourselves within the academy, but we are intellectually impoverishing ourselves by not seriously taking diaspora on as part of our Africa. And this has to do with another, so that's a way forward. Another way forward is about radical epistemological transformation in the academy. My first book, The Walking Quran, is not an effort just to describe the way that Islamic knowledge practice works in an African Muslim society. I take on the epistemology of embodied knowledge transmission as generative, and I write a history from within that epistemology. Not translating the categories from another society and making them comprehensible and acceptable to white audiences in Western spaces, but rather taking them as seriously productive and generative of meaningful intellectual insight, not monumentalizing them or memorializing them, but rather deploying them, marshaling them, using them to produce new knowledge and new meaning in academic spaces. And until we take on that task, our power relations with respect to the African continent will always be imperialist. We will take knowledge from Africa and use it to build careers in other places. So the epistemological part is one, and then the last thing that I'll end with is that this also has to be a practical engagement. And that has to be developed through collaborative work with our colleagues in the diaspora. A few people mentioned Cadesria. As a graduate student, I was able to participate in a dual intellectual citizenship workshop where I made lifelong friends with African graduate students. And over a span from 2007 to 2016, I organized workshops in Dakar that brought together African academics, African graduate students, American academics, and also, because these were on Islam, classically trained Muslim intellectuals from Senegal. They wrote papers in Arabic, we wrote papers in English, and we did the academic debates in Wolof, which was the language that everybody understood. It was a way of trying to create a space for a new kind of conversation to happen where peer-to-peer intellectual enrichment was at the heart of the Africanist intellectual exercise, rather than researcher-to-informant relations. And as long as we continue to leave unaddressed the imperialist and the surveillance, the CIA-oriented nature of what we produce in terms of Africanist knowledge, to paraphrase Rolf Trio, we will be the ones affixing the silencer at the end of the imperialist's gun. We will be participatory in the vast acts of violence that have produced poverty and suffering, both on the continent and within the diaspora. Thank you for your time.